Well, good evening. I was just mentioning down here in the front, if I recall last year, it was also a rainy day, and it's been like that for quite some time. So maybe there's a tradition now that with the kicking off of the Nimitz lecture series, it's typically a nice rainy day, but I got to say that it's actually pretty happy to see all that rain. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 28th Nimitz lecture series. Thank you very much for attending. The Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Memorial Lectureship was established in 1983 with a gracious endowment from friends and supporters of the Naval ROTC program. And with the first lecture series beginning in 1985, we've welcomed distinguished scholars, professional military members, and government officials for a series of lectures on a wide range of national security subjects. Since those early days, the lectureship has been hugely successful, bringing in a great array of talented lecturers, including Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, former Secretary of the Navy Dr. John Lehman, the Honorable Tom Lantos, General Anthony Zinni, Lieutenant General Bernard Traynor, Ambassador Barbara Bodine, and many, many more, including last year's the author and noted domestic foreign policy expert, Tom Ricks. Through the efforts of those who helped us inaugurate this now seasoned series, we have enlightened many in the university community on pressing issues of our time, exposed our midshipmen and cadets to poignant figures in global national security affairs, and have enriched the academic experience for so many here at this university. Originally, a committee comprised of midshipmen from the Cal NROTC unit would nominate their choice for speaker. Over the years, the committee membership has been adjusted to incorporate members from all three ROTC units on campus, well represented here, I see, here in the back. My gratitude extends to my compatriots in the Air Force and the Army ROTC units and to the combined committee of cadets and midshipmen who aptly chose this year's speaker. And this brings me to my introduction. For obvious reasons, words such as war, Afghanistan, Taliban, Pakistan, are on the minds of many, many Americans today, and thus it's particularly fitting that we present to you our 2012 Nimitz lecturer, noted expert on Central Asian affairs, Mr. Ahmed Rashid. Mr. Rashid was born in Pakistan and educated in the West, having attended Malvern College and Cambridge University in the UK. Part journalist, part author, part advisor to political figures and diplomats around the world on Central Asian issues, Mr. Rashid began his career as an accomplished writer on Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Pakistan in the 70s following his experiences in Balochistan, a province in western Pakistan. Because of his unique background as a Western-educated Pakistani journalist and writer, he quickly gained a footing in areas not well understood or easily accessible by Western writers. Over the years, Mr. Rashid gained unprecedented access to key regional actors in the geopolitical landscape of Central Asia. He was in Afghanistan when Soviets took power in 1978, was the first journalist to interview with the Taliban in 1994 following the tumultuous period after the Soviets' departure, and he was embedded with the Taliban as they entered Kabul in the late 90s. It was because of this tremendous exposure that he authored Taliban, Militant Islam, Oil and Fundamentalism in Central Asia, which is a pre-9/11 account of the rise of the mullahs in Afghanistan. After 9/11, this book became a must-read for reporters and military personnel alike and has since sold 1.5 million copies. Since Taliban, Mr. Rashid has authored Jihad, The Resurgence of Central Asia, Islam or Nationalism, and most recently, Descent into Chaos, the United States and the Failure of Nation Building in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, a book the New York Times called a caustic review of the mistakes by the Bush administration in tackling Islamic militancy. And incidentally, next week, he has a new book coming out entitled Pakistan on the Brink, U.S. Policy in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ahmed Rashid has been called Pakistan's best and bravest reporter by the late Christopher Hitchens in his Vanity Fair article On the Frontier of Apocalypse, and currently writes for noted publications such as the Daily Telegraph, the Washington Post, the International Herald Tribune, BBC Online and The Nation. He regularly appears on NPR, CNN, and the BBC, and is a guest professor at Columbia University. He is a recipient of the 2001 Nishar Osmani Award for Courage in Journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ahmed Rashid.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very great pleasure, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'd also like to thank Midshipman Coe, who apparently first suggested my name to the committee, and I'm very grateful to Coe. Let me, I mean, it is very sad that, it is very sad, but very poignant, and I suppose very timely that I'm here at this moment when there is a real crisis in Afghanistan, and there's real debate going on as to what U.S. policy should be. The Afghans are discussing it amongst themselves, and this recent tragedy of the killing of 16 Afghan civilians, 9 children, by this U.S. soldier, which only followed the burning of the Qurans, which led to the death of 6 U.S. soldiers killed by Afghan soldiers, has, of course, intensified the tensions in the region. Not to speak of Iran, the dangers of Iranian nuclear weapons, and the real crisis in Pakistan, which is probably much more serious than many people realize, and is probably far more important than Afghanistan in the long term. Tonight I will deal with Afghanistan and how I see the situation, and hopefully come up with some kind of way out of the present dilemma. And the day after tomorrow I'll talk about Pakistan, and also a little bit about Iran and the dilemmas that the US faces there. Let me start by saying on Afghanistan that at the moment we are faced with what I call 3 circles of crisis. The first circle is an international crisis situation. The U.S. is not alone in Afghanistan. It has 49 countries have troops in Afghanistan. NATO is there. And there's an enormous discussion going on right now about what to do about Afghanistan. So there's an international debate and a lot of confusion as to what the international community is going to do. The second circle of crisis I would call a regional, the regional issue, which are comprised of the neighbors of Afghanistan who have all their own aims and ambitions, and several big powers that are close to Afghanistan and have enormous influence there. And the third, if you like, circle of crisis is the domestic situation inside Afghanistan, and to whether the Afghans themselves are going to be able to cope with a US withdrawal. So let me briefly start with the international situation. As you know, the British Prime Minister David Cameron is here. The British have 10,000 troops, 10,000 troops in Afghanistan, and there's enormous pressure. 80% of Britain's public want an immediate withdrawal of British forces from Afghanistan. And clearly, if the British were to leave early, like next year, rather than 2014, when the Americans are scheduled to finally depart, there would be a huge crisis in NATO, because the British contingent is very large, and Britain, of course, is a very close ally of the US, and it would lead to a rollover effect in the rest of Europe. The French have already decided to pull out by next year. Other countries could follow suit. Spain, Italy, Germany have major contingents in that country, and they also face enormous domestic pressure at home, especially with this economic crisis in which Europe is beset, to pull out forces. And of course, if these forces pull out before NATO agrees on a common timetable, there will be enormous depression in Afghanistan and enormous uncertainty in the region. So a lot of this will have to be worked out by the time of the NATO summit, which is in Chicago in May. The Chicago summit was just a few weeks ago was being billed as a kind of celebratory summit in which the Western powers would announce their timetable of withdrawal. Now it seems everything is up again for discussion, and in the next 8 weeks or so, NATO and the Western countries will have to come to some agreement, possibly bringing forward the time of withdrawal of their forces, given the domestic crisis that all these countries face. So, and secondly, there's a lot of pressure, of course, in the U.S. In the last poll I read, 60% of the American public want a withdrawal from Afghanistan, and President Obama has not made it clear, but it's possible that the 2014 date for the withdrawal, the final withdrawal of U.S. forces, could be brought forward to the end of next year. The U.S. military is not in favor of that. It wants a two clear, what I call fighting seasons in Afghanistan. That is the summer of this year, 2012, and the summer of next year, before troops are withdrawn. But you know, the political climate in the U.S., the economic climate is likely, and of course the election coming up in November is probably likely to dictate the withdrawal timetable more than what the U.S. Will mean. And what we are losing here, of course, is that when President Obama announced that U.S. forces would be leaving in 2014, back in 2009, at that time it was very clearly stated by the U.S. that this would depend on conditions on the ground as dictated to by the U.S. military and by NATO. And clearly now we are in a realm where the withdrawal is not going to be dictated by improved conditions on the ground in Afghanistan, but are going to be dictated by agendas which are more related to the crisis in Europe and the crises in the United States itself. The second circle is the regional issue. Now, and this is far more severe. Afghanistan is a landlocked nation surrounded by 6 neighbors, Iran, Pakistan, China, and 3 Central Asian republics, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Now, all of these neighbors have carried out gross interference in Afghanistan. All of them fueled the civil war in the 1990s between the Taliban and what was then the Northern Alliance. And there's every indication that, given the fact that now Afghanistan has been at war for 30 years, more than 30 years, 33 years. That's probably longer than many of you young people who are at university. You weren't even born when the war in Afghanistan started and the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. The fact is that the Afghans are very fearful and very resentful of their neighbors, all of them for various reasons. The Pakistanis have backed the Taliban, Iran, India, Russia, and the Central Asian states have backed what was then the non-Pashtuns, the Northern Alliance, in the civil war in the 90s. And certainly if there's a premature withdrawal by Western forces, and there's no agreement among the regional powers, we are going to have another repeat of the 90s with regional countries backing one warlord or the other warlord, one ethnic group or the other ethnic group, leading to a continuation of this war in Afghanistan, leading to a continuation of the civil war. Now, apart from 6 immediate neighbors, there are 3 very powerful near neighbors. India, which has traditionally backed whoever Pakistan has backed. So India has backed the Northern Alliance because Pakistan backed the Taliban. Saudi Arabia, that has traditionally always backed Pakistan. So Saudi Arabia in the 90s backed the Taliban, although this time round it seems preoccupied with the Arab Spring and what's going on with Iran. But it is still a very influential power. And Russia, which of course, has enormous influence in the three Central Asian republics. And you've seen Russia's attitude regarding Syria. It has been consistently blocking U.S. policy, blocking any UN Security Council resolution. And there's every chance that Russia is going to put up a lot of roadblocks on the way, if not directly through the Central Asian republics on the U.S. withdrawal. And the other very important power, which is a neighbor, a direct neighbor, is China. We don't tend to talk very much about China, but China has an enormous stake in Afghanistan. It's investing now in minerals and wants to extract minerals and oil. But more importantly, China is worried about its own Muslim population in Xinjiang province. That is the Uyghur ethnic group, which border Afghanistan and have now been, a lot of them have fought with the Taliban. They've been indoctrinated with the idea of Islamic extremism and independence, and China has been is deeply worried that guns, opium, money is coming from Pakistan and Afghanistan to unsettle them. And China, of course, has taken a very tough line against the Uyghurs. It has executed dozens of people it has caught, claiming that they are militants or that they have been training in Pakistan or Afghanistan. Now, when President Obama came in, he announced a policy that myself and other experts had long been supporting, which was the idea that the Americans have to broker a regional pact before you can withdraw. In other words, you have to get the regional countries, the neighbors, on a table and be able to persuade them that they should sign an agreement whereby they do not interfere in Afghanistan once the Western withdrawal takes place. Now, there was an initial impetus to do that, but what we've seen is in fact, in the last 4 years of this administration, not the fault of this administration, but a very serious deterioration in the regional situation. There was, Obama reached out to Iran initially, if you remember, wanting to start a dialogue with Iran. That has become obviously totally submerged with the nuclear crisis. There's no dialogue between the Americans and Iran. How will you stop Iran interfering in Afghanistan? Perhaps through other European countries who have influence and can talk to the Iranians. The relationship with Pakistan, which under Bush and Musharraf in that era, after 9/11, they were allies. Pakistan went after Al-Qaeda, arrested or captured or killed something like 500 members of Al-Qaeda, many of them who are in Guantanamo right now. But at the same time, Pakistan pursued a dual policy, which was to give sanctuary to the Afghan Taliban. Those who escaped 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan fled into Pakistan, and they revived the insurgency in 2003. And right now, we have a complete breakdown in relations with Pakistan. It's been almost 4 months. There's been no dialogue between the two countries. A series of incidents with Pakistan, between the U.S. and Pakistan. The U.S. demanding that Pakistan do more to clamp down on the Afghan Taliban, particularly the Haqqani group. At the same time, Pakistan getting more and more angry at the drone attacks that were taking place inside Pakistani territory, and public anger building up against the Americans, and a number of incidents which culminated in the November attack on Pakistani forces inside Pakistan by U.S. helicopters, after which Pakistan almost broke off relations basically with the U.S., and most importantly closed the road that supplies U.S. forces in Afghanistan that goes from the port of Karachi, which has traditionally been the port for Afghanistan, the entry port, because Afghanistan is landlocked, closing the road, and that road has been closed for 4 months. The US and NATO have been trying to bring in increasing supplies from what is called the Northern Distribution Network. That is a network of road and railways that basically come through the former Soviet Union into Central Asia and then into Afghanistan. But that route is extremely expensive. It takes 3 times as long for goods to come along that route. The Americans can't bring in lethal military equipment along that route. It all now has to be basically flown in. And more importantly, a withdrawal is going to entail a massive exodus of US armor and vehicles and equipment. And I read the other day, I think people were talking about 30,000 containers will have to be extracted from Afghanistan back to the US. And if the Pakistanis don't open their route, doing this through this backward process through Central Asia and Russia is going to be extremely difficult and extremely expensive. So actually what we have is now a situation where the regional equation is in enormous disarray. There's less and less likelihood that the US and NATO are going to be able to bring the regional countries together with a pledge not to interfere in Afghanistan. And as a consequence, the Afghans, of course, are extremely nervous. They are more nervous right now about their neighbors, with the Taliban sitting across the border in Pakistan, with the Iranians threatening to have influence, with the Afghan Shias, and with ethnic groups who the Iranians have traditionally backed. So there is an enormous problem right now as to how, in the next year and a half, how is the regional situation going to improve when Iran, you're faced with this crisis of nuclear weapons in Iran, and Pakistan is really, as the title of my new book suggests, Pakistan very much is on the brink at every level, economic, social, political. It's got its own Taliban problem, but this is something that I'll deal with. Now, the other part of the region is that all the neighboring countries of Afghanistan are in a state of crisis. If you look at Pakistan, Iran, and the 3 Central Asian republics, they're beset with political crises, with serious economic crises, and with astonishing levels of poverty and illiteracy. So the 10 years, 11 years that have been spent in Afghanistan, again, many people like myself have been urging for a sort of Marshall Plan, not just for Afghanistan, but for the region as a whole. And this was not done for a variety of reasons, largely because of Iraq and US involvement in Iraq and the expenditure and the deployments that took place in Iraq. But the regional situation overall in each of these countries has deteriorated. So they are less likely to be able to provide a policy of non-interference in Afghanistan and a policy of support for the Afghan government once the West withdraws. And finally, the region is now beset with the spread of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. In Pakistan, we don't just now have the creation or the expansion of the Afghan Taliban morphing into the Pakistani Taliban. We have Taliban groups now operating in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan. You've got Chechens who've been training in fighting and training in Afghanistan, fighting American forces who want to go back to Chechnya and revive the war there. You've got all sorts of, you've got Kashmiri groups, Muslim groups who've been fighting in India against the Indian authorities, also now fighting in Afghanistan. So Pakistan and Afghanistan has become, even though at the same time there has been definitely a decimation of Al-Qaeda, the death of Osama bin Laden, the killing and capturing of large numbers of Al-Qaeda leaders in this region. But you've got an explosion in regional groups in Pakistan and in Iran who have been inspired, armed, trained, and given battle experience by either the Taliban or by Al-Qaeda inside Afghanistan. So the regional problem has become much more dire, much more acute than it was when President Obama took over. And really, I said the last point, but the last point is actually the growth of anti-Americanism in the region, which makes it much more difficult in whether it's Iran or Pakistan or Central Asia even. The growth of anti-Americanism, the lack of trust between the United States, NATO, and these regional countries makes everything much more difficult. Now, let me come to my third point, which is the domestic crisis in Afghanistan. Well, there are numerous facets to this. The first is that there is no, as you know, talks are going ahead between the Taliban and the United States, which President Karzai has been very keen on in the past, but there is no consensus on this. There's no consensus inside Afghanistan on reconciliation. Afghanistan is made up of multiple ethnic groups, and the majority ethnic group, the Pashtuns, who have been supported by Pakistan in the past, I wouldn't say represented by the Taliban, but the Taliban are 80% made up of Pashtuns. Now, on the other side of the hill are the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Hazaras, the Turkomans, and all these other ethnic groups who have links not so much to Pakistan but more to Central Asia and Iran, have been vehemently against the Taliban, and today they oppose very strongly any effort by Karzai to talk to the Taliban. So you have an ethnic divide in Afghanistan, which has always been there, which has always been up or down depending on what kind of regime you've had. But you've now got a very acute ethnic divide between the Pashtuns who want a dialogue with the Taliban, and that includes, Pashtuns who support the government. President Karzai himself is a Pashtun, the people around him. They want a dialogue with the Taliban so that this war can end. But this dialogue is vehemently opposed by the non-Pashtuns. And Karzai has been very inept, in my opinion, in trying. He's really not attempted to build a national consensus over the last 2 or 3 years, something that the Americans, the Allies, have been stressing him to do, and he hasn't done. The second part of all this is the economy. The domestic crisis is being fueled right now by a real downturn in the economy. There was, of course, a major attempt in the latter part of the Bush administration, and certainly in the Obama administration, which launched enormous. Nobody wanted to call it nation building, but there was a military surge in 2009, 2010, but there was a massive civilian surge for the first time, which was an attempt by the U.S. to build, institutions and an economy and send in civilian advisors. But what happened, of course, was that the insurgency got wider and worse. The fighting spread further, and these civilian advisors and the money that was allocated for building up the economy and institutions never really got spent in the proper way. So you have an economic crisis which is obviously going to become much worse when Western forces leave. Afghanistan, after 10 years, still does not have an indigenous economy. Now, Afghanistan, people may argue, didn't have one before, but it did. Afghanistan was a rural economy. It grew enough food to feed itself. It exported some surplus of food to neighboring countries, especially fruit and vegetables and nuts and things like that. And it had small cottage industries, which gave it a very small surplus. But right now, we have a situation where most of the Afghan economy is dependent on providing services for the Western forces. There are 150,000 Western troops, and they all need guards and drivers and interpreters, and tens of thousands of Afghans are employed by these people, by the foreigners. And when the foreigners leave, these Afghans, who have now become educated, they become used to a certain lifestyle, they support certain values, they believe in the democratic transformation of Afghanistan, these people are basically going to be out of a job. And there is not a sufficient economy which can absorb these people, neither in the state sector nor in the private sector. And this is going to be, I think, one of the biggest crises that both the West and the Afghans face. And already you're seeing a huge influx of young Afghans fleeing to Europe as economic refugees, trying to smuggle themselves into Europe. You're seeing a huge outpouring of money, and the middle class, people who can afford it, are moving their money out to Dubai and other places, buying property there, etc., expecting the worst when the Americans withdraw. And thirdly, you've got opium production. Now, opium production, of course, has fueled the black economy in Afghanistan and has been a major contributor to corruption and the inability of the Afghan government to really focus properly on creating a legal white economy. But there has been enormous strides taken in reducing the areas. I mean, at one stage by the end of 2004, 2005, I mean, almost the whole of Afghanistan grew poppy, which produces opium and heroin. That has been now drastically reduced. Most provinces of the country, 34 provinces, are free of opium production, except the provinces which are in the south and the east, which are the areas more or less controlled by the Taliban. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda have used the money from drugs for supporting their terrorist activities. And as I said, it's also fueled the corruption in Afghanistan. But the gains that have been made in the last 4 or 5 years in reducing opium production are likely to be reversed. Because what are peasant farmers likely to do once, you know, the handouts from the Americans and the money is drastically reduced, development aid is reduced, foreign forces pull out? Peasant farmers who have been encouraged in the last 4 or 5 years to grow alternative crops, who've been given subsidies by US forces, etc., to do that, are going to go back to growing, you know, what they know best and what will give them the biggest profit, which is opium. And the ability of the Afghan armed forces and state to control that is very limited. So we will have a huge economic crisis. Now, the thing that the US has focused on very dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years, perhaps too late, has been the building of the Afghan army and police. The aim is to have some 350,000 army and police and paramilitary forces by the time of 2014. Although because of the economic crisis in Europe and the US, that figure is already being debated and is likely to come down to perhaps 250,000 or even less. But nevertheless, there has been an enormous effort to equip. You know, the US has spent something like $10 to $12 billion a year for the last 3 years to train and equip Afghan forces. The problem still is that are these Afghan forces going to be capable of holding ground and fighting off the Taliban, protecting the major roads, etc., once Western forces leave? And there's a big question mark about that. We've seen, for example, tragically how the Taliban have been able to penetrate into the Afghan armed forces. You've had these killings of American and British soldiers by Taliban army recruits who obviously were infiltrated in either by the Taliban or by Al-Qaeda or by people. So how reliable are the Afghan forces? How capable will they be of holding off the Taliban? And how quickly will this, how effective will this transference of power from Western forces to the Afghan forces, how effective will this actually be in real terms on the ground? Now, quite frankly, most Afghans don't believe that the Afghan army will be in a position. I think one of the big mistakes made by the Bush administration was that this process didn't start immediately in 2001, 2002. There was a long delay in starting this process, and there was a very slow build-up to this, again, largely because of Iraq, because the US didn't want to spend that kind of money when it was spending this enormous sums of money in Iraq. And it's only in the last 3 or 4 years, the last year of the Bush term and the first few years of the Obama term, that we've seen this focus. So that is an added problem. Now, A few words here about the Taliban. The Taliban, you know, have really I think any guerrilla force that is able to maintain sanctuaries and safe havens in a neighboring country really cannot be defeated. And you certainly saw that, the older generation, you saw that in Vietnam. As long as the Viet Cong had a safe haven in North Vietnam, they were able to resupply, etc., and later in Cambodia and Laos, you were not able to defeat them. And that has been very much the case, you know, with Pakistan and its relations with the Afghan Taliban. You've not been able to come up with a policy which would be attractive enough for the Pakistanis to send back the Taliban or whatever, or use sufficient force, if you like, to do that. And I will talk more about Pakistan when, you know, in my following lecture. But the Taliban have also proved that they are enormously resilient. And despite the night raids, the special forces, the helicopter attacks, the attempt to capture or kill the mid-level leadership, the commanders in the field, the body counts, etc., the Taliban draw on an enormous reserve. First of all, the Pashtun population in Afghanistan, but also the Pashtun population in Pakistan, which is 3 times the size of the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. So we're talking about a huge, and plus they've got all these foreign fighters, you know, which I mentioned earlier, who are able to, you know, boost their manpower. And the Taliban have proved not only resilient in their own areas in the south, in the Pashtun belt, but they have expanded right across the country. And Taliban actions are taking place in the north, on the border with Central Asia and China, in the west, on the border with Iran and Turkmenistan. And there's really no estimate. I mean, most people still presume that when the Taliban launched a summer offensive, the height of their summer offensives and fighting was in 2005, 2006. They were able to put something like 25,000 fighters into the field. They're still able to put 20 to 25,000 fighters into the field every summer, every year, every fighting year. Now, if that is the case, maybe, you know, those fighters are younger, they're not so experienced, they're not so battle-tested, etc. But the fact that you physically have not been able to deplete the numbers of Taliban who are opposing American NATO forces in Afghanistan shows that there is not only a resilience but also enormous reserves of manpower on which they're able to draw upon. And clearly the worsening economic crisis in Afghanistan, I didn't mention one figure. I mean, the last UN figure is that 1/3 of Afghans are still suffering from malnutrition. Which is an amazing figure after 11 years, 10 years of a enormous Western presence, you know, in that country. But clearly the economic situation is going to drive many young people into the arms of the Taliban in the next, you know, couple of years. So, and then we are faced with the problems coming up in 2014. If 2014 is going to be the year of withdrawal, that is also the year of Afghan elections. Is the US going to withdraw its forces before 2014? In other words, or is the US going to provide cover for presidential elections in Afghanistan? Now, the last presidential elections were a disaster. There was enormous fraud. The first elections, which were held under the United Nations in 2004, were much better. They elected Karzai as president. But the last elections in 2008 were a real disaster. And warlords turned into politicians, turned into businessmen, manipulated the polls. The government itself manipulated the polls. And there was an enormous disillusionment. If we have another of those kinds of elections in 2014, you know, I think that's an enormous challenge for the US and NATO right now as to what kind of elections will be held and what role will Western forces play in that election. Secondly, Karzai has to step down because according to the Afghan constitution, he's only allowed 2 terms in office. He's completed that. There's enormous pressure on him, and there's an enormous public disillusionment with him inside Afghanistan. Will he step down or not? That's another very big question. So I've painted you a very bleak picture right now, but let me now try and come up with where I think we need to go. I think the bottom line is simply that the U.S. cannot leave Afghanistan in a state of civil war. If you are going to leave Afghanistan expecting that the Afghan army is going to somehow continue the war against the Taliban for all time to come, it won't happen. The government could collapse in 6 months or a year. So essentially, we need to end this war. We need to reduce the conflict and end this war and bring about some kind of resolution between the government and the Taliban. Now, that process has already started with the talks that are going on. The talks, there have been many attempts over the last 3 or 4 years, backed by Karzai, to talk to the Taliban. The Taliban have been very hesitant to do so. But about 2 years ago, Germany approached Richard Holbrooke, who was at that time running AFPAC policy from the State Department and was the head honcho of the Obama administration. He was approached to say that, there are representatives of Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader, who want to open a dialogue with the Americans, not with Karzai, but with the Americans. And there was a long process by which the Taliban enlisted the Gulf state of Qatar to be its sponsor. And there was for about a year, there was a secret dialogue between the Germans, the Qataris, and the Taliban in order to prepare the ground for the Taliban to meet with the Americans. For the last year, at the beginning of last year, the Americans had their first meeting with the Taliban. There have been several meetings since then. There is a dialogue, but this dialogue is going on extremely slowly. I see this dialogue as needing 3 or 4 different phases, in which basically we're still a year or 2 years down the road, still in phase 1. And that is, first of all, to build trust with one another. The Taliban have made demands, for example, as you know, on wanting to free 5 of their key commanders who are held in Guantanamo. There's a U.S. soldier who's being held by the Taliban. If there is an exchange of prisoners, of those prisoners, that would be a major step forward to build trust. But, there are numerous other steps that the Americans obviously want the Taliban to take, that the Taliban want the Americans to take. But the second phase, in this trust building, the second phase would be what you would need major confidence building measures between the two to show that both sides are effectively fulfilling the process of dialogue. And that would entail CBMs on the field, in the field, which would obviously have to be carried out by the military. The U.S. military on one side, the Taliban on the other. So, for example, the U.S. could offer, well, we'll stop these night raids, these special forces night raids in a certain province for a certain period of time. If you, Taliban, will stop your assassination campaigns or whatever in that province for a certain period of time. And let's see if, first of all, if you can deliver, and let's see if we can deliver on both sides. And then you could expand those CBMs into a wider region, covering more provinces, with a longer time frame, etc. And the final phase would be some kind of the start of negotiations, political negotiations between the government and the Taliban, which would ultimately aim to provide some kind of power sharing for the Taliban. Now, each phase of this dialogue is beset with problems. Nobody's, underestimating the problems. Not to speak of, will the U.S. military trust the Taliban? Will the Taliban trust the U.S. military? And after that, will the political dialogue actually take off? If the Taliban say, we want Sharia law, we want an Islamic state, we want nothing to do with this constitution, that you've enacted, well, obviously, that is not going to be acceptable to the Afghan government or to the international community. And there are all sorts of issues here regarding women, education, the future of democracy, etc. Now, the real question is, why should the Taliban negotiate right now? The indicators are the Americans are leaving. The Taliban have to hang on another two summers, and after that they can try and, defeat the government and walk into Kabul. Maybe that will take another 1 or 2 years. Now, I sincerely believe that the Taliban really want to bring the war to an end, and they really want to negotiate. And I base that on a few assumptions, which have emerged with meetings, with the Taliban and retired Taliban. The first is that the Taliban are as exhausted and tired as anyone. They've suffered horrendous losses, despite their abilities to sustain themselves. They want this war to end. Secondly, they want to go home. Most of the leading fighters and the commanders and the Taliban Central Committee, the Shura, is sitting in Pakistan. They're fed up. They want to go home. Thirdly, they're fed up with Pakistan and the manipulation that they've been under by the Pakistani intelligence. They are Afghans. They believe they're very proud people, as people who've been in Afghanistan know very well. They want to go in back home, and they want to end their subservience, if you like, to the Pakistani military and the Pakistani intelligence. And fourthly, most important, why would they seek power sharing with somebody like Karzai? They ruled, I was in Afghanistan right up to 2001. Afghanistan was on the verge of collapse. I mean, the Taliban regime had basically collapsed by the beginning of 2001, simply because there was no money. There was no aid. All the donors had been driven out because of the presence of Al-Qaeda there, or the harsh measures taken by the Taliban. And the country was literally on the verge of collapse. The leadership of the Taliban know that they are in no position to rule the country alone. If they do it, first of all, they don't have the personnel still to do that. They don't have the technocrats, the ability. But most important, they know that the international community will walk away again. They'll be left, and in 6 months, the whole Afghan population will be anti-Taliban. So the best way is, why not strike a deal with the government, which is still accepted by the West, which will continue to receive aid and support from the West, strike a power-sharing deal. What their long-term aims will be after that, I really don't know. Although they claim that, we don't have any objective to seize the country or to rule again. But in areas where the Taliban are predominant, particularly in the south and the east, obviously they will want some political office, some control over resources, development funding, etc. that come in. So, I think the only way out. Now, the problem here has been with the Americans and with the Obama administration, that there's been a lot of infighting within the administration as to how seriously to take these talks. Sections of this administration, I would particularly say the military, the intelligence, even people in the State Department have not really been assured that, are not really sure about whether these talks will lead to anything. But my assumption is that really you have no other choice. If you want to end this war before you leave, you have to make an attempt at reconciling the Taliban with the Karzai government. And certainly nobody is going to be in a position to do that once you leave. Neither Pakistan nor anybody else, because the Iranians will never accept Pakistan, the Pakistanis will never accept Iran. Nobody else can mediate this, once you've left. And so then we're looking at really a prolonged civil war, which of course would inflame the whole region. So I think, The war can end. I think these talks should be speeded up as quickly as possible. They should not be made hostage to the Republicans who have, Romney and Gingrich have already condemned these talks as being, a sellout by Obama and weakness by Obama. These talks should not be held hostage by the election timetable here or by anyone else. They should be speeded up and as quickly as possible. I think what we need now is a full-tilt diplomatic surge by the Americans, by NATO, which will include talks with the Taliban and a renewed attempt to bring about some kind of consensus in the region towards the American withdrawal and a non-interference agreement. I'll end here and happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
We'll have about 15 minutes of questions. Please just ask one question at a time. We will have a reception following this at the faculty club where you'll be able to have a little bit more one-on-one dialogue with Mr. Rashid if you'd like. And just to plug our lecture on Thursday, please come again on Thursday at 7 o'clock and feel free to grab one of the books from our previous lectures.
Good evening, sir. Cadet Bauer. You mentioned that we should have peace negotiations with the Taliban. Assuming that we would do these negotiations and the Taliban would come to some sort of power-sharing agreement where they would take over, as you said, the south or the east of Afghanistan, from your perspective, do the people actually want this? Do the people want the Taliban in power?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, certainly the Taliban have a political base in that region. And when I say take over, I don't mean take over in the sense of, obviously it would be in line with the central government. The central government would still be providing bureaucrats and administrators and money and aid, etc. And clearly there would be Taliban representation in the central government also. Yes, I mean, it's a huge problem. The Pashtun population in the south, are now very polarized. There is a very strong anti-Taliban element and probably a larger pro-Taliban element. And it really going to depend on what the Taliban have to offer. We've seen that they have moderated a lot of their positions. For example, they have stopped burning down schools. They are allowing education. They're allowing girls to go to school right now. And presumably, in a process of negotiations, you'd be able to beat them down into accepting a lot of what has gone on in the last 10 years, which has been very progressive and very positive for Afghanistan. I mean, certainly, Afghans are not going to accept the Taliban of the 90s, where all the schools were shut down and the economy came to a standstill and, sports were banned, football was banned, etc., etc. I mean, people are not going to accept that. And I think the Taliban realized that. But, all this is going to emerge through a process of, first of all, bringing about some kind of cessation in hostilities or ceasefire, and then political negotiations.
What does the leadership and organizational structure of the Taliban look like?
We don't know, basically. Well, I mean, there is a central shura, a central committee based in Pakistan, which provides money, logistics, and designates, major targets and things like that. But I think there's enormous autonomy on the ground by the commanders. There are also, of course, as you know, different factions of the Taliban. The Haqqani network claims it is loyal to Mullah Omar, but basically they operate on their own. And they are much more capable of launching attacks into urban areas like Kabul, etc. There's the Hizb-e-Islami run by Gulbuddin Hikmatyar. But But I think essentially in these negotiations, the Taliban today are a political entity. I mean, the loyalty that the Taliban have proven to Mullah Omar and the Central Committee remains very strong. So I don't think it's in anybody's interest right now, especially if you're having negotiations, to try and kill or capture the Central Committee or Mullah Omar. Because, I mean, if you do that, if you fragment the Taliban even more, then, of course, negotiations, peace settlement, etc., will be just so much more difficult. Because you won't be dealing with a single entity. You'll be dealing with fragmented commanders, and you'll have to strike political deals with each commander as you go along, which will be impossible. So I think that the fact that the Taliban, after 11 years, still have a central entity that you can talk to is very important. And the fact that Mullah Omar carries clout. You know, I mean, the big question is tomorrow if there's a CBM, you know, with the US military, and Mullah Omar gives an order saying, you know, no more attacking school teachers, Afghan administrators, whatever, in 5 provinces. Will the commanders on the ground accept that? Many of these commanders are influenced by Al-Qaeda. Others are influenced by other influences. Will they all accept that? And that's going to be a huge test for the Taliban's authority, whether they still command that authority. I think, you know, the command. I don't see any element of the Taliban who are fighting the Americans right now trying to buck Mullah Omar or trying to go past him or trying to nullify one of his orders. I still think, you know, he does have, he is a supreme leader, if you like.
Mr. Rashid, do you see a role for either China or India in these talks with the Taliban?
You know, the Taliban have made it very clear to several interlocutors, including, I think, the Americans, that they have no gripe against China or India. That Indian you know, the fact is that who's going to invest in Afghanistan? Certainly not the West. Afghanistan has a lot of mineral resources, oil, etc., which can be exploited and which can salvage the economy down the road, maybe in 5 to 10 years. The only likely countries to invest in Afghanistan are major neighboring states, Russia, China, and India. So if you say we don't want the Indians, we don't want the Chinese, you're actually, you know, cutting your own throat, basically. So I think the Taliban will be quite amenable, and they're not going to, even though Pakistan may push them to force the Indians out of Kabul, I don't think that will be acceptable to the international community. It certainly won't be acceptable to the Indians. And at the end of the day, it won't be acceptable to the Taliban. So, you know, I think these big neighbors who have investment potential in Afghanistan will find a niche to operate. And Pakistan and India will have to come to some kind of agreement as to making sure that they agree on each other's presence in Afghanistan without coming to blows.
The original premise for the United States intervening in Afghanistan was supposedly because the Taliban had given Al-Qaeda a safe haven there. What is the current status of Al-Qaeda, and if there was a power-sharing agreement and NATO and everybody left, what's the assurance that they would not allow Al-Qaeda to reestablish or some other replacement group whose main target would be against the West?
Well, the Taliban have issued several statements, and the interlocutors who's been speaking to them, the Germans, the Qataris, the Saudis, other countries, you know, have been told repeatedly that they have no links with the Taliban and they will renounce the Al-Qaeda. But they're not going to do that at the beginning of the negotiations. Publicly. I mean, the Americans, for example, have been insisting that the Taliban make a public statement to condemn Al-Qaeda and to, you know, the Taliban have said, look, we are not with Al-Qaeda. We don't allow Al-Qaeda into our ranks, etc. And Al-Qaeda, as you know, is much depleted now in Pakistan with the death of Osama and the capture and killing of large numbers of Al-Qaeda leaders through these drone attacks and other things. But where we are is that these talks have to be done on a basis of without preconditions. Now, neither are the Taliban saying to the Americans, well, you have to immediately give us a timetable when you're leaving. Or the Americans say to the Taliban, immediately renounce al-Qaeda. I think what you will see, as I said, this is a process that will carry on maybe for a year or two. And at the end of the day, you will get public pronouncements saying that the Taliban, in any deal that they have with the Americans or with the Karzai government, will not allow any non-Afghan group to operate in Afghanistan alongside them. I think they've already made that decision. But naturally, there are going to be enormous problems if al-Qaeda is likely to sabotage this dialogue. We saw the killing of one of the negotiators, Professor Rabbani, a few months ago, which actually halted the negotiations for more than 3 months because there were enormous suspicions that the Taliban had killed him or that al-Qaeda had killed him. And the Afghans accused Pakistan of killing him. Now, we don't know who killed him, but the point is that there are going to be a lot of similar kind of assassinations, bomb attacks against interlocutors. You know, the Taliban are opening an office in Qatar. I mean, that office could become a target for al-Qaeda if al-Qaeda thinks that the Taliban are selling out al-Qaeda. So, you know, it's not going to be an easy way. And I think, I believe that the Taliban have broken their links with al-Qaeda.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman Third Class Davis, California Maritime Academy, Global Studies and Maritime Affairs. In America, we hear that the increased drone attacks are having a good effect on the American effort. But I want to hear from your point of view of how the Taliban are taking it and how the civilian population around them are taking it.
Well, you know, most of these drone attacks are taking place in Pakistan. And I'll deal with that issue in my lecture in Pakistan. But yeah, I mean, the drone attacks are, without a doubt, fueling enormous anti-Americanism. Of course, initially, the Pakistanis were secretly involved with the Americans with the Bush administration in particular, in carrying out these drone attacks. Some of the drones were actually taking off from Pakistani air bases. Which was, of course, totally denied by the Pakistanis. And every time a drone hit Pakistani territory, the Pakistanis would complain and say, you know, this is an impingement of our sovereignty and all the rest of it. Even though the Pakistani military was deeply involved with the Americans, it suited the Pakistani military to have these drones take out some of these al-Qaeda and Taliban nests. But there has been, obviously, a very strong negative effect, which has been the increase in anti-Americanism along this border belt where the drones have been used.
I was wondering if you know about Hekmatyar, if he's involved in the talks, and Haqqani, because Talibans are fragmented, so are they joining the talks, or it's only between the Mullah Omar and...
Well, you know, Hekmatyar has been involved in talks for quite some time with Karzai directly. He sent his own a team of negotiators to talk to Karzai. They've met with the Americans in Kabul, with the American commanders in Kabul, with NATO. But, you know, Hekmatyar, frankly, militarily is irrelevant. He really doesn't command a large military force. He doesn't have popular support at any level. He's a real, you know, he's been a rogue all his life and continues to be a rogue. But ultimately he knows also that he can't strike a deal on his own without Mullah Omar and the Taliban. Haqqani is basically, there has been an attempt by Pakistan intelligence to try and bring the Haqqanis to talk to the Americans. And there was a meeting in August in the Gulf between the CIA and the Haqqanis, which was brokered by Pakistan. But essentially the Haqqanis have said that they will leave the negotiations to the Taliban and they trust Mullah Omar in whatever he does. So I think that's an indicator that the mainstream, you know, it is the negotiations with the mainstream Taliban which are going to be all important. I don't think there's going to be a need to have, you know, subsidiary negotiations with other groups of Taliban. I don't think anybody is going to challenge Mullah Omar from the Afghan side. The Haqqanis also, by the way, have suffered enormously, and large numbers of their personnel and their leaders have been wiped out. a lot of them also want to go home. So the Haqqanis, are very belligerent. They've launched, just 3 months ago, they launched this attack on the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. But, within their ranks, there are quite a number of their fighters and commanders who are fed up and who also want to go back. They're fed up of living in Pakistan.
Final question, please.
My opinion is that Afghanistan has a weak, central, corrupt government surrounded by corrupt warlords and ethnic groups. Adding the Taliban into the mix, doesn't that just add one more tribal, corrupt group?
Well, at the end of the day, you may be right, but at the moment, at least, these warlords are not fighting the central government. A lot of them are involved in making money, largely through opium, but they've morphed from being warlords into businessmen and into politicians. But of course, a lot of these warlords are rearming because they fear that the Taliban may come in and they will want to defend themselves. But the crux of the conflict is between the Taliban and Western forces and the Afghan government. And if you want to reduce the violence so that some kind of decent withdrawal can take place, I think two things are needed for the Americans. One is a measured withdrawal in which you're not fighting, shooting behind your back as you withdraw. You want an honorable withdrawal from that country. And you want the possibility of some forces staying on, perhaps to train Afghans, etc., a strategic pact, which of course has its own problems because the Taliban will be opposed to any staying on, even of American trainers, for the Afghan army for any time beyond 2014. And the second thing that you need is bringing this civil war to an end finally before you leave. And I think that really rests with the Taliban. And I think as I say, the North, these warlords who are opposed to these peace talks at the moment, at the moment these peace talks have delivered nothing. Let's see down the road as these talks actually start delivering dividends. Areas that become peaceful, development that can take place, civilian administration that can function. And the Taliban settle down and don't fight in every corner of the country, then I think you could see a better rapport between the warlords and the central government. On the question of corruption, of course, I think everybody has contributed to the state of corruption in Afghanistan, and frankly, the dangers of an economic collapse in Afghanistan post-American withdrawal will only add to that corruption. So corruption is not going to go away in a hurry. I hope that there will be elections. We will have a new Afghan president in 2014, and he will set a new vision and new benchmarks for the nation. I think Karzai is at the moment extremely unpopular and disliked by the population, partly because of the corruption.
Thank you, Mr. Rashid.